Wow.
Good morning. Good morning. All right. Let's see. This one sounds good. I got the book full of all kinds of Celtic blessings, so I'm just picking them at random, but this one sounds like a good one to start the morning with. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Lord, you have welcomed us. You have healed us. You have restored us. You have fed us. You have empowered us. Send us out to live and work to your glory. Send us out to revel in your presence. Send us out to declare your love. Send us out to proclaim your goodness this day and always.
Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, welcome back. Class 4 in our series. I'm excited to be here with you again today. And let me just get my stuff straight here. All right. So I hope you've been enjoying what we've covered so far, as much as I have putting it together, because it's been a fun series for me. And as a reminder, let me go ahead and get rid of that little notification thing there, if I can. There we go. We'll install my antivirus stuff later. If you would like to catch up, or if you're looking for them, you can find these videos online displayed on our Facebook account or our YouTube page. So the little review, last week we talked all about the life and witness of St. Patrick. So we talked about his prayer life, his days as a shepherd, then his time of being enslaved and escaping from that a couple times actually, and the way that dreams were a part of that process for him. We also talked about his calling into ministry, his work of evangelism, and how I see as those two things, we see that in his name Patrick, which if you'll remember, translates to mean one who frees the hostages. So you can kind of see how with his work of evangelism to Ireland, he was about that very task. And that's probably how he understood his calling as a minister and bishop. We also talked last week about the spiritual practice of peregrination or spiritual wandering. So wandering away from one's community and trusting oneself to God and the hospitality of those you encounter along the way. And so we saw how Patrick lived this himself. We also talked about kind of some contemporary applications of that. And then we talked a little bit about the scary E word, evangelism, and share our faith, the liberation that we found, much like Patrick, with others. So this week, we're finally going to get into Celtic monasticism. I feel like I've been saying that for 3 weeks now, but we're actually going to talk about some of its significance in the arrangement of society at this moment in history. We're also going to talk about St. Cuthbert and St. Kevin, a couple favorites of mine. We'll talk about the practice of soul friends, and we'll talk about walking the rounds as our spiritual practices for today. And then we'll also briefly touch a little bit on silence. And I like the timing of this, us getting to talk about this at this moment in the year, because here we are about to launch into Lent. And so probably some of us are beginning to think through, how is it that I want to dedicate myself to God in this coming season for prayer, fasting, and almsgiving? Well, maybe we'll get some ideas today in the material that we cover. But first up, monasticism. Let's see. So in the Eastern Orthodox Church, in the Celtic Church, much like the Eastern Orthodox Church, monasticism is very significant. A difference, though, maybe is that because of the arrangement of society at this time, monasticism was more widely participated in by many, many people. It was almost a way of organizing somebody's, your village. It was for men and women, and they could be together at the same place, or they could be, it could be a convent, or it could be just monks. But even families with children would live in monasteries. at this time. And it was very much what you would think. It was a very intentional, single-minded pursuit of knowing the divine. So their life would have been arranged according to the practice of regular worship. So right now in our tradition, our prayer books kind of simplify the monastic offices that St. Benedict originally set up. So we have morning prayer, noonday prayer, evening prayer, and Compline, right? So we've kind of condensed those. Part of what people say about how that got condensed, by the way, was almost 1,000 years after this point. But the expectation was that you'd be out working the land in some form or fashion, or maybe about some kind of craft, and then you would come into the chapel to pray at various times of the day. So that would have been the arrangement in these monastic centers as well. They would have had a chapel building that they would have come to, put down the till, go pray for a while, go back to the till, go eat lunch, that kind of thing. So that would have been the pattern for life here. It's said that at this point in history, the monastic communities were in some ways an annoyance for clergy. Because they were always pushing for reform. Because if you can imagine what that kind of fervency can create, right? And then you see this institutional hierarchical system, and so you can imagine it creates a rub sometimes to push each other, and I want to just kind of go on the record and say I welcome that. You guys see me slipping into complacency, you give me that holy nudge and tell me your idea. Much time on this, but I just want to see if I can hit it and go. There we go. Let's see what happens. It's back for a moment. So part of, and here's a word I want us to unpack for a second. So part of the intensity of the warrior culture that they were coming from was this love for intensity, right? And so this makes me think of asceticism, which is something we're going to be talking about more of during the season of Lent. Does anybody know what the word ascetic means? Kind of this, right, austere, simplified, and usually for some kind of purpose. So chasing some religious ideal or practice, right?
Maybe like Anabaptist.
Exactly. So that would be or like the Desert Fathers and Mothers or something like that. But this practice of fasting and simplicity, maybe even kind of going back to the peregrination practice that we talked about last week, that denial of having a home for oneself and always being on the move. That kind of missionary work can also be an outgrowth of asceticism. Let me find where I am here. Refraining from physical pleasures. This could also have to do with like the clothing you allow yourself to want or buy, that kind of stuff. Celtic people enjoyed testing themselves. They enjoyed trials. Whether they wanted to or not, they had to endure it sometimes just because of the ways life was like in this era. But it's interesting to note where this is present and where this is absent in our culture today. So in the Christianity of today that we think about, I think it's easy for us to even forget that there is one of the fruits of the Spirit is this call for self-control. And how is that manifest at this moment in history? I like to say that it's the forgotten fruit of the Spirit at this age when we think about all the decadence and luxury that we have available to us. And so it's worth asking oneself, what would this look like at this moment in history if we were to try and, kind of revive the practice of self-control? What areas might that affect in our day-to-day life? So another part of monasticism's appeal was that they were very much a people kind of on the margins of the known civilization, right? So you've got the continental European area, and then you've got these islands out here by the sea. And even with some of the monastic developments that you can go visit to this day, they're often out on some kind of peninsula by cliffs with the ocean right there. So very much on the edge. And I told you about my experience living in Marfa, just being kind of that far away from civilization, if you will, and how it does affect your mindset, right? And I think this was part of the Celtic world mindset, was this existence on the margins, so to speak. They also, as we talked about a couple weeks ago, lived in tight communities where the community was kind of the focus as opposed to the individual. Let's see. And lastly, kind of going back to the peregrination thing we studied last week, there was certainly an appeal to the sense of adventure that was in the Celtic heart, and their love for pilgrimage. We're all, but I think that's really more of a human thing. We all have that desire to quest and to grow and to deepen. And hopefully we never lay that aside, although I think sometimes that temptation exists. But when we picture these monastic communities, what comes to our mind? Like visually, when you think about what this looked like?
Dark robes.
Dark rooms.
Dark robes too.
Oh, dark robes. Yes.
In the movie that I've been watching.
Sitting out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. So particularly in the earlier context, so the 6th, 7th century, these would have been kind of the type of buildings that you would see. Yeah, very much, kind of like thatched hut type deals. Similar to some people call this beehive, although I'm going to show you something in a minute that's a little different, that's more of the beehive style. This is kind of hilarious that I stuck this on here, but it was the best picture I could find. So this is from a TV series called Vikings. Anybody watch that? Yeah. Put out by the History Channel. About 4 or 5 episodes into the first season, the Vikings have kind of organize themselves, and they sail for the first time over to Lindisfarne on the coast of the British islands there. And this was their portrayal of the monks at Lindisfarne. And one thing that you notice is that all the buildings were wooden at this time in history. Now later, this is Lindisfarne. So this was after being destroyed in the late 8th century. Rebuilt, they desired more fortification, so they used rocks, right? And so these are in ruins, and there are buildings all over there now. Anybody been to Lindisfarne? It's pretty far north, kind of right there at the cusp of where Scotland begins. But, so wooden buildings, and then later on, you get places like this. Anybody know the name of this place? Anybody been here? So this is Skellig Michael. So this is, you can see that they've used stones here. This is definitely an example of one of those situations where it's kind of on a cliff's edge. Actually, this is on an island off the coast, but you've got seas around. Where am I? This is off the southwest coast of Ireland, facing the Atlantic Ocean. It's believed to have been established between the 6th and 8th century. It's an important place for seabirds, and so you've got puffins and all kinds of stuff nesting here. And if I had a backed up picture of the island, you'd see that there's like a valley between these peaks that they call the Saddle of Christ. There's a path up from the bottom that you're able to walk to. There's also on the whole island, which isn't too large, there's a flat plain of about 3 acres that's good for farming, and that's it. So, and I can't remember, see if I wrote it in the notes. This is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
And it's uninhabited.
And I think this is called the Eye of the Needle or something, the peak there. Do what?
It's uninhabited, right?
At this point, I would imagine so, but obviously it was lived in for a good long stretch. Here's kind of a cutaway reproduction to show you a little bit about what the inside of one of these would look like.
Those remind me of the Navajo Hopi.
Doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Barbara?
Is this their living area or is this their chapel?
This one, the way this is kind of depicting, looks like it's some kind of little worship space, but I'm guessing that some of these were living quarters also. Yeah, haven't had the pleasure to go yet, but now I've got a goal.
I think there's a NOVA or Nature, it's a PBS.
Mm.
Yes.
Science
Yes.
On this island?
I was wondering
Because
where
they
it's from.
were looking at the puffins.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
So, all right, we talked a little. Any more about monastic life? Anything that you were curious about that we didn't touch on? Yes.
When I think of monasticism as compared to today's society,
Mhm.
of course, there's a big gap.
Yeah.
Back then, though, 1,000 years ago, society was not highly organized, it was
Right.
agrarian, and so how much difference was there between the monastic life back then and the non-monastic, the regular
Yeah.
life of being in a small village or working a farm or, tending your sheep or pigs or.
So an interesting question to learn, and I did not see this in any of my preparation, but that would be what kind of vows and understanding of vows did they have? Because these days, if you're going to join a monastic community, there's a period of formation that leads up to taking vows. The assumption will be, unless some kind of major crisis happens, that these are life vows and that a person's going to stay in a community. But as I was saying, you had families with children and whatnot living in these monastic communities. So I don't really know. I have to know that it was more loosely organized. Yes.
Well, I'm sort of thinking of Shaker Village in Kentucky. It's a reenactment village. And
Yeah.
The Shaker community was very much like the monastic communities. And they were a real draw because if you lived in what was the frontier in the early 1800s, life was really awful.
Yeah.
And if the husband died, the wife and kids were left pretty much destitute.
Yeah.
And they would come into these villages because when they worked together, they had running water, they had a lifestyle that was so much better than the surroundings. They got together and everybody washed clothes, and so they had machines that washed clothes. It was a standard of living so much better than frontier life.
Stability. And what you said reminded me of another facet, which is, so the monastic communities were important throughout the British Isles. However, they were much more important in Ireland and the Scottish, what would now be Scotland. For the purpose, or because of the fact that when during the period when Rome was in the British Isles, they only went up to so far on that main island, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's where the cities and towns and roadways and whatnot were established. So they had more developed cities and then religious institutions around those and affiliated with those, whereas in Ireland and Scotland, life was much more rural, had never been developed by Rome or anything like that. And so these communities were more hubs for society and common life together. And they would have been a place for, if you find yourself in a hard spot, you go to a monastery because there you've got stability and food production and shelter and all that kind of stuff. Mm. So let's talk a little bit about St. Kevin and soul friends. First of all, soul friends. Anybody heard this term before? Anam Cara is the Celtic word for this. I got the book actually here by John O'Donoghue, if anybody hasn't already discovered this book but is looking for a good read on Celtic spirituality, this is a good place to start. John O'Donoghue, an Irish priest, he's now dead, but he died fairly recently and also fairly young. And there's a wonderful interview with him and Krista Tippett on the radio show On Being. You can find that podcast, and I promise you it will not be a waste. But so Anam Cara, soul friend, essentially what this is a mentoring relationship that was prevalent in early Celtic Christianity, where there would be somebody that you would meet as a spiritual guide, that you would meet with regularly as a spiritual guide. We talked about St. Bridget a few weeks ago. One of her quotes that I thought was relevant: without a head, like water of a lake that is polluted, neither good for drinking or bathing in. That is a person without a soul friend. So pretty definitive words. But what is a soul friend? It can be a person, male or female of any age, but somebody that you can be open and honest and truthful with, someone that you can share your struggles with. More than anything, a person who's a good listener, somebody who can really listen to what you have to say and then help spot for you corners of your life that maybe you can't see for yourself. So they can call you on your BS, right? When you're maybe in a little bit of self-denial or self-deceptions going on. But they can also help you spot untapped dreams and provoke you to follow after those. So what are some modern examples of this Anam Cara idea?
Spiritual director.
Right. So spiritual director being the most one-to-one. What's another example of this?
I think of my prayer group, my fourth day group from Curcio, and two of those ladies are here in the room right now, Marge and Barbara, as my soul friends.
Yeah, absolutely.
We meet once a week.
Yeah.
We meet often.
Yeah.
And discuss our apostolic failures and our apostolic successes.
Very good.
Which are none.
Yeah, right. Yes.
Yeah, can you spell the soul train?
The what?
Or can you spell soul train?
Soul friend, like a friendship.
Oh, soul friend.
Yes,
You know
yes.
what? You know what? I kept thinking of soul train.
Soul train, a little different. Yeah. Also a good practice.
Does your psychiatrist know?
So very good question, because I think a counselor or a psychologist or psychiatrist could be this. Yeah.
I think EFM becomes soul
Yes.
friend community.
Yeah. Absolutely. Anywhere where you have that work of discussion and discernment and back and forth, but also where people can be open enough to where they're actually vulnerable. Because, often when we get here on Sundays, there's a tendency to kind of pretend like we have our lives together and all that. We know the truth. Yes, Pat?
What about the support groups like Alcohol Anonymous or the
Oh, yeah.
Wise of Alcohol?
Absolutely.
Family members or drug groups.
And within that structure, you also have sponsors,
Yeah.
right? So it could be someone from the group, or it could be a sponsor, or a multitude of things. And, I came out of the kind of evangelical world, and so a word that you hear over there that's a little different but kind of similar is accountability partner, right? But somebody that you're going to be open enough with that you talk about your struggles and temptations and pray together. And but any kind of mentoring relationship is essentially, yes.
How about a pitch for Bible study?
Yes. Say why though? Because what happens there?
Well, we studied the book itself, and, you know, I give a history and so forth, but then my group gets all of the input, and they really
Yeah.
talk. It's wonderful.
Yeah,
So-
very good. Yes,
How about your spouse? My spouse is my soul friend.
certainly. I think that if it's only your spouse, then there's going to be stuff that you don't get into, right? Because if it has to do with the spouse, or if it's, you know, but absolutely, one would hope that you would have a relationship where you could talk about those biggest questions that matter in the world and life. Yes.
Those of us that have gone to marriage encounter, our spiral could be our soul friends.
Is that something that you could explain,
We meet twice a month.
the spiral thing, or?
The spiral thing after marriage encounter,
Mm-hmm.
and we talk about we give a presentation and talk how we can increase ourselves in the community and in with our spouse, etc. Not you.
Oh,
Well, I meant like that.
Jane is relieved.
So let's in keeping with this, we'll come back to this in just a minute, but I want to tell you a little bit about St. Kevin of Glendalough. So Kevin was a monk renowned for his wisdom, lived in the 6th century, and he was a spiritual friend to many. He actually lived, I don't want to get ahead of myself. There, like a lot of Celtic saints, you have stories of Kevin kind of communing with nature, praying a lot in nature, even having experiences where animals would bring him things like food for his survival and whatnot. Exactly, you have, I mean, you find it in the old Russian saints. I mean, it's a pretty prevalent theme. So Kevin felt called into the ministry, and so what you did back then was you went to the monastery to be formed for ordination. Now, obviously, I should say that a lot of people were at monasteries who were not pursuing that kind of life or vocation, so they were not pursuing ordination or anything. But Kevin went because that's where the bishop would have been, and you would have studied under the bishop for formation. Immediately following his ordination, though, he got up and went out to a hermitage. So thanks for the ordination, guys. See you later. I don't think that would fly these days. But he went out to a hermitage for 7 years. And there's a place called St. Kevin's Bed, which is right there beside the upper lake at Glendalough. And here's a picture that I was able to find. Sorry, it's out of focus a little bit. But a beautiful setting. And it said that he set up a little hut for himself that he lived in, where he subsisted on nuts, herbs, and water. Apparently a white cow would occasionally visit him and give him some milk, and there were some otters who would also deliver him some salmon occasionally. And people knew where he was, and they knew that he was wise and renowned for his active prayer life, and so they would go seek him out for spiritual counsel. My favorite story of Kevin involves a blackbird. So his little cabin was too small for him to sit in and stretch out his arms, but that's how he liked to pray. So he ended up sitting in the cabin with one of his arms sticking out a window. And one day he's there praying, as he does, and a bird lands on his hand. And he feels the bird, but he doesn't immediately shoo it away. And then he notices that the bird is starting to build a nest. And now he's got this question in his mind, what to do. If he pulls his hand in or shoos the bird away, then he's going to squelch this potential for new life that's happening in the palm of his hand. And so he keeps his arms outstretched, and the bird builds the nest, the bird lays the eggs, the The eggs then hatch. Then he has to wait for the birds to be old enough to like get out and fly, right? And you know, Kevin, the story that's told about Kevin is that he kept his arm out through this whole process. I love this story because I think it is a parable for us about yielding or surrendering to something that was not in the plan. Essentially, you know, how can we manifest this disposition that we hear of St. Kevin in this story? So he's not sitting there in agony thinking about how he can rid himself of this bird, but instead he's engaging the moment with a sense of great love and this act of hospitality. And when I hear this story, I immediately think of the church today, and I ask the question, what would it look like for the church of today to embrace this kind of yielding to the ever-evolving circumstances with a heart grounded in love and hospitality? Any thoughts? He didn't want to crush. Yeah. And he didn't want to do anything to disrupt or disturb that new life that was beginning to blossom.
But the notion of Christ saying, pick up your cross and follow me is not going out and doing what you want to do. It's doing what he's telling you to do.
Yeah.
Following him.
There you go. Yes.
I was thinking, what would we do if we came to church on Sunday and a homeless family had pitched a tent in our parking lot? What would we do?
Was that before or after we threw him out?
I mean, that's what it immediately came to my mind.
Yeah.
That's what we do.
And the answer is a challenging question, right?
And you had somebody with a broken down RV out there.
We did.
Same sort of thing. Then he was here.
Yeah.
He was here
For about 10 days. Yeah.
Barbara and I we were the last ones in last Saturday, and there was the lady when I went to lock the door to leave, and she was out there asking for gas. She was for her car.
Oh.
There was a car, she was on the run.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, Lord, is this a task? All right. So I said, if you can hold on just a minute. And I was working on trying to lock the door, and I couldn't get the door locked. And I came to Barbara and I said, so there's a lady outside, and she's looking for gas for her car. But the other story is I need help locking the door. Can you come help me?
Yeah.
So we went together. Barbara showed me again how to lock the door, but I gave her money because she waited there all that time because I said, just wait for me for a few minutes.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out how to lock the door, all of that. She just waited very patiently and she was very grateful. So
Yeah.
the question is, what do you do?
Yeah.
You know, who is this person? You don't know. Could be a scam. She goes everywhere, but I don't know that. So
I'm so glad to hear that there is another sucker in this world.
yeah, there is. That's me. Yeah.
That was wonderful, Jen.
Yes. Bringing this back to the soul friends piece, and trying to tie this with Kevin's experience with the bird, there is this, I think, generativity that comes with being able to yield our own agendas and egos, to stay flexible in this way, as Kevin's story depicts. And it involves some vulnerability and transparency, but I also think it has that potential for deepening of one's faith and being called ever closer into the life of God. Yes, Pat?
What about that policeman that adopted the
Mm.
child from the woman that was on drugs and took care of her?
That wasn't in the plan.
Has he? I couldn't believe that he could do something. That was amazing.
So what, if we were to kind of think about this, so there's certainly like a listening component, a listening for God's leading, and then a willingness to say yes and respond that's in this.
Yeah.
Also, I think vulnerability is a piece, especially when we go back to the idea of soul friends, because we're opening ourselves up to another and bearing our soul in a way that's not comfortable at times. and yet at the same time has such a potential for healing and allowing God to speak in new ways into our life. This topic of vulnerability is one that has become somewhat of a popular buzzword, if you will, lately, a lot due to the writings and work of Brene Brown. Anybody familiar with her stuff? Highly recommended. Get any of her books. Brene Brown, not
Also on
Renee, but
YouTube.
with a B. Yeah, and you can find her TED Talks on YouTube. Now, I want to go ahead and say, of all the discussions I've ever been a part of or classes, the biggest flop that I ever did that did not go over well was a talk on vulnerability. And you can imagine why, right? It's a tough topic to talk about. But it is a path towards a certain kind of freedom that I think God wills for us to walk in, being able to claim our identity and place in our journey, stand our sacred ground, and not be puffed up about it, but to speak truth from that place. Yes, there was a couple hands.
Oh, you mentioned Krista Tippett. Who was her conversation with?
John O'Donohue. Absolutely love that. So
John
yeah, if you go into iTunes or any kind of podcasting app and search John O'Donohue, you should be able to find it. Absolutely wonderful interview. And I think he died shortly thereafter, in his late 50s. So, kind of sad. But let's see here. Yes, go ahead.
I found I have a hard time giving homeless money.
Mm-hmm.
And just recently, I had purchased gift certificates for my grandkids, and I had one left over.
Yeah.
And I pulled up to Montgomery and I-25, and here was this couple. And I thought, I've got that gift certificate. And I got it out, and I gave it to them. And so it occurred to me, I could do that.
Yeah.
I could have these
Right.
$10 gift certificates to give to the people.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm gonna do.
And just to kind of circle back to something that I'm hearing is also that inherent tension in trying to navigate those kinds of moments. Am I being taken advantage of? Am I being called to extend generosity? I'm a big believer on erring on the side of generosity.
When I worked at the diocese on Carlisle,
Yeah,
we would have a lot of people walk in.
yeah,
And if they wanted gas or anything, I would tell whoever's in the back, that I'm putting the phone on answer and I'm taking them over to the gas station.
okay,
And
Yeah.
putting gas in their car or buying them
Yeah.
lunch or something.
Yeah. But it's
I
tough.
have a hard time giving money
Yeah.
because I don't know.
And, I think each instance is a time for discernment. When we were in Calcutta, we had all kinds of people coming up to us in the streets. And the advice that the missionaries of charity would give to us is to not to those people, because often we would be propping up child slavery stuff that was going on, because you'd have a kid this tall asking for money, but they're going to go turn that money over to some adult who's got them essentially enslaved. And so instead, the push was to try to rely more on the kitchens and orphanages and things like that. And so it's worth being frank about sometimes there's deception involved or worse.
And I've
yeah.
had people walk out
Yeah,
because that isn't what they want.
yeah, right, yeah, I've had that too. So I do want to get to Cuthbert before we run out of time. So the other saint for today, St. Cuthbert of Lindisfarne. Now, St. Cuthbert was a contemporary of St. Chad. They were born the same year. They were both bishops, and they were both bishops at the same time in neighboring dioceses, and they both studied for ministry at Lindisfarne, following in St. Aidan's footsteps. where am I here? One of the things that he was known among other things, was praying all night long in the frigid seas there, because Lindisfarne's right there on the coast. So originally from the area Northumbria, he also began as a shepherd, later became a monk, then a priest, and briefly was Bishop of Lindisfarne. So after being a priest and a monk at Lindisfarne, Cuthbert left to live a life of solitude. So he spent many years, most of his life really, as a hermit on the outskirts of civilization, surrounded by a wilderness. And there he would pray, interceding on behalf of all creation, joining his voice in union with God's prayers for this world. And he did a lot of this, by himself, so you can imagine all the silence that went into that. Why do I have a duck on the center of the screen? Because Cuthbert, among other things, is sometimes spoken of as the first animal rights activist, because there on Lindisfarne, it is a place for a lot of seabirds to nest, and he instituted, when he became bishop, a rule that protected these birds. Does anybody know what these are called? Any birders?
Eider duck.
Yeah, so the cutty duck, well, but I think that's what they were after, was the eider, right? For the pillows and stuff, yeah. So, but cutty duck after Cuthbert. So apparently he made a rule to protect these. Venerable Bede wrote of him, and if you know, Bede is one of the historians from about, I think, the 9th century, who recorded a lot of this early English Christian history. About Cuthbert, he wrote that he was a fire with heavenly love, unassumingly patient, devoted to unceasing prayer, and kindly to all who came to him for comfort. Words that I think any one of us would be happy to have spoken about us. So, living a fiercely ascetic lifestyle, he would wander out onto the shores at night, which brought back memories for me. Has anybody ever had the chance to go out onto a beach at night? It's pretty amazing. You've got this expanse of water in front of you that feels endless. You've got the stars overhead that feel endless. I remember one time when I was living in Galveston, the time change was happening, and I think it was on a Saturday night. Well, it would have had to have been, I guess. And so the clock, my alarm, I did not, so years ago I had a phone that did not wake me up on the morning of the time change, and now I had to be at church early the next morning. So I set my alarm in this funny way, not understanding which way the time was shifting, and so I basically woke up in the middle of the night. So I went on a run along the sea's edge there in Galveston, and it was a beautiful night that I'll never forget. But this was Cuthbert's practice, to do this regularly. He would wander out onto the beach, and he would actually wade out into the water and pray, and you can imagine how cold that water was. A monk, the story goes that a monk from the monastery there got very curious about what it was that Cuthbert was up to in these nights. And so he followed Cuthbert out there and just spied on him all night long. And what he says was that Cuthbert waded out into the sea and was standing there in the waters, saying the Psalms, reciting his prayers, did this all night long. And then at some point nearing morning, he comes back up onto the beach, and a few otters ran over and curled up on his feet and dried his feet off and then warmed his feet. And then Cuthbert blessed them, and they went back to their home. All right, where am I going here? So here's the picture of him in the ocean, actually.
Why did he go into the ocean? Why not just stay on the beach? Why into the water? I don't get that.
Yeah, why not?
God told him to.
Yeah. Maybe it was, you never know what could have been going through his mind. Maybe the feeling of the water kind of rushing up and then going away on his feet was somehow part of his prayer imagination.
Well, if he sat down, he might fall asleep.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah, and that would keep you awake if that was your goal. There you go. It's part of that kind of monastic asceticism, I think, also. That, it's a challenge. It's a trial. Can I do this? This is what I want to draw close to God, and I'm going to show God I mean business. So after 10 years of solitude, maybe not the first period, because he would come back in periodically throughout his life, in and out from solitude. But after a 10-year period of solitude, people knew of him. They essentially drafted him to become bishop. They needed a bishop, and they wanted someone with his prayerful and wise disposition. And so he was then the bishop at the time of the Synod of Whitby. And we're going to talk more about that next week. That'll be part of our main focus along with Chad. But essentially, this was a time in history when the Roman Church was telling the Celtic Church, you guys need to bring things in order. We need to get on the same page about stuff. And so here is what we were asking you to do. And so there was this period of division, if you will, potential for schism, and eventually a drawing back together. And Cuthbert's level-headed, prayerful mind was one of those voices for union that fostered the eventual harmony that came from this, which is one of the main things he's remembered for. Something I think our world could use a lot more of today, if you think about it. Those prayerful, peaceful presences of unity that help draw people together amongst times of division. Silence. I do want to get to this because we're about to break. Is it 10 o'clock already? Oh, goodness. All right, well, I may have to get to walking the rounds later. But let's do this. Lent's coming up. There will be opportunities for us to introduce changes that we hope will in some way bring us closer to God. I'll go ahead and tell you what I'm thinking about doing, and maybe you can kind of brainstorm ways that you might want to do the same thing. But I've noticed occasionally this little gadget right here, my phone, can get in the way of my relationships sometimes with my family. And so but I need it for work, right? And so one of the things that I want to do for the season of Lent is put my phone away when I get home in the evening and not get it out again until my kids are in bed. All right? And so I'm thinking of what can I do? Our faith teaches us that our relationships are worth really paying attention to and cultivating. This is going to be a very practical step for me, but I would invite you to be thinking of what's some kind of step that you can utilize to introduce a little bit of silence, a little bit of maybe being more in the present moment for this season. Maybe take a little inspiration from Cuthbert. We don't have any good seas to walk in around here, but is there a way that you can set aside some time in your life to be more present with God in the upcoming season? Maybe it's not setting aside the phone, but getting up a little earlier for time of prayer and reading. Think about what that would be for you. And I apologize for not leaving enough time for some discussion and the rest of what I had, but I do want to read one of my absolute most favorite poems to you. This is John O'Donohue. So this maybe will get you inspired to go out and find that interview that I was talking about. This was a poem that he wrote for his mother when his mother died. And I love the words of this, and so here it is. On the day when the weight deadens, important to, so this was a poem he wrote for his mother when his father died. So she's newly widowed. On the day when the weight deadens on your shoulders and you stumble, may the clay dance to balance you. And when your eyes freeze behind the gray window and the ghost of loss gets into you, may a flock of colors, indigo, red, green, and azure blue come to awaken in you a meadow of delight. When the canvas frays and the currach of thought and a stain of ocean blackens beneath you, may there come across the waters a path of yellow moonlight to bring you safely home. May the nourishment of the earth be yours. May the clarity of light be yours. May the fluency of the ocean be yours. May the protection of the ancestors be yours. And so may a slow wind work these words of love around you, an invisible cloak to mind your life. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.